Okay, let's get out your worksheets, and we're going to take some time to look at the book of Zephaniah. And there are a number of things for us to think through with this particular book. But let's begin with, what did you think about the book overall? What did you think about it? Zephaniah. You like this book? Christina, what do you think about this book? You guys are already thinking about Turkey, but I'm going to get something out of you today.
I liked it. I think it definitely went back to the very heavy on judgment and very heavy on grace, which I felt like we kind of rerouted a little bit. So that was kind of nice to have a balance between the judgment but also God saying, for those that do follow me and stay true, there's definitely some reward in that, and it's not for nothing.
So we're back into a standard prophetic book, and so we got that judgment going again, but you didn't feel like it was just this sense of, this is just awful. You felt like there was just a strong balance of what God's going to do. Okay, all right, good. Eric, what'd you think?
A little terrifying, actually.
Okay, a little bit different experience here. Were you guys reading the same book?
Yeah, when I was just going through it a few times, I was just like, wow, this is pretty powerful, and what's going to happen? Especially the whole, your blood's going to pour like dust, and your intestines are going to be like refuse, and just all the different things, the calamities that are going to occur for those who are against God. That was pretty powerful.
Yeah. And that's why it's really nice when you see that little bit of grace thrown in there. It's like, oh, thank you, thank you, thank you. Adam, what'd you think?
Along the same lines, I was actually texting Eric in the process of this and just talking about what that means, like how bad it's going to be for a sinner that day. But at the same time, I was also able to see the grace in it, especially toward the end, where I can't exactly find it now, but it was basically saying that we're going to rejoice over God.
Yeah, verse 14 of chapter 3 is one example of that.
Yeah, and so when I saw the grace within the book, I was able to look at it a different way, and I could see that the punishment was a way to bring the people back to the grace of God.
Yeah.
And so it kind of changed the whole outlook of the book after I recognized that.
And if you can make that connection in all the prophetic books, I mean, really, God's design with discipline is to turn his people's hearts back. And in that sense, discipline is always grace. It's God's goodness to us. Now, it's hard to feel the grace of discipline, but if you read passages like in Nehemiah, I mean, Nehemiah makes it so clear. Let me see if I can just reference it real quick and the exact chapter. But in Nehemiah chapter 10, is it 9? In Nehemiah chapter 9, what it does is it goes through the history of Israel, and it shows all the ways that God disciplines his people, trying to turn them back, and yet they still don't listen. And I can't even remember what prophet we just read, recently, where it said, I did this and you still didn't turn. I did this and you still didn't turn. I did this and you still didn't turn. I mean, that's God's reminder that his discipline is his grace. He's trying to get our hearts back. Just like with a parent disciplining a child, it is so that they turn away from that which is going to be harmful to them. So discipline is actually love. It's actually grace. It's goodness. And when you have someone in your life who loves you enough to discipline you, you're a fortunate person. And so when we read these books, now, the other nations, so Zephaniah talks about other nations, that's a different category. If they don't turn to the Lord, it's going to be a disastrous situation. But with the Lord and his people, like in the end of the book there, you have this remnant that is going to experience the blessing. God is turning. God is giving them the opportunity to continue to turn back to him. Well, what'd you think about the main message? What's the main message of the book? What'd you come up with, Zach? Main message. Lead the way for us.
The main message was, the Lord is going to judge Judah for their rebellion and the nations for their pride, but will preserve a remnant and offer salvation to all nations because of his love. Okay, so you covered the book there. We got Judah, who's going to be disciplined, the nations, but then there's going to be some blessing that's going to be poured out as well. Elise, how would you say that differently?
I just said that the main message of Zephaniah is on the emphasis of the day of the Lord, that there's restoration and destruction.
Yeah, so day of the Lord is a way to capture all of this, because day of the Lord has both components, right? It has the destruction that can come as well as the restoration that can be a part of that. Destruction for those who oppose God, and then the restoration for those who are actually followers of the Lord. And so you can have that as a common theme. And so even when you look at this main message right here, the universal day of the Lord. So on page 112 in your notes, Zephaniah's main message is the universal day of the Lord. And he prophesies during the reign of Josiah. Now, is Josiah a good king or a bad king? Good king. So we see revivals that take place during the time period of Josiah. He's a king in Judah, so the northern kingdom gone. We've got the southern kingdom that remains. And so back in 2 Kings 22 and 23 is where we really find this story, somewhere in the years of 640 to 615. Now, what do we know about Zephaniah? Again, you can see what his name means, and there's actually some confusion exactly about what the exact meaning of his name is. You can read that. But the name is used of 4 individuals in the Old Testament. So we see that he's described as a descendant of Hezekiah. So in chapter 1, in verse 1, we have the word of the Lord which came to Zephaniah, son of Cushi. So we've got some information there. Son of Gedaliah, son of Amariah, son of Hezekiah. So when we go back to Hezekiah, again, we've got a good king. A revival took place underneath this. So, godly heritage. In the days of Josiah, son of Ammon, king of Judah. So look at point number 1 there, the prophet. He takes his name back 4 generations. Now that's very interesting. We haven't seen that before. Generally, if the prophet identifies with anything, it's simply a king or a series of kings, kings of Israel, kings of Judah. But here it goes back 4 generations, and you can see that he has both a royal line, so we've got this kingly line, but it's also a spiritual heritage. And so he's really, got this godly heritage that's been a part of his family. And now why he takes it back 4 generations, I don't know, probably to connect it to someone like Hezekiah. He's also a priest, and so you can see all the references there that support that, a Kohathite, and the references along with that, and then priest, father of Josiah or Hin. So we've got these 4 different individuals that are mentioned as Zephaniah in the Old Testament. But it looks like, what is the connection? We don't know between all of those. Are they the same person? And so you just have to do more study on that. This is where we have a difficulty trying to connect the prophets to actually names that are written back there in the history of Israel. But look at point C. He may have had a hand in the reforms of Josiah. And this is where this becomes really an important element in the book, because if he had a hand in the reforms of Josiah, then we understand that his prophetic message probably is one of the things that triggered. But Josiah's ministry is a long time, and those reforms took place fairly early. So if Josiah's reforms had already taken place, and he's prophesying during the days of Josiah, and he's prophesying later on, then what happened? Did the nation turn back right away? So it goes on and says, if so, his message here is given some more thrust to the reforms. He's denouncing syncretism. However, if the reforms were superficial, then Zephaniah may have come afterward to re-communicate Yahweh's message. And so that's the issue with where Zephaniah fits within Josiah. When you read Josiah's story, Zephaniah, or any prophet for that matter, does not play a major role in those revivals. So what is Zephaniah's, how does he fit actually? So look at the introductory comments. Similar to Joel, the day of the Lord is central to Zephaniah, and this is more in this book than any other book. And so that's why, if you have day of the Lord as part of your, main message, that makes sense, because it's all over the place in this book. Also, that day or that time becomes a part of it. Now, when you look at the next page and see the background issues, again, we have he prophesies during the reign of Josiah, king of Judah. So you can go back and read this story in 2 Kings 22 and 23. But to summarize, you can see there, he's a king who did right in the eyes of the Lord. He planned for repair work to be accomplished on the temple and subsequently found the law. This is that time period where it's like, whoa, what's this? And they find God's law. It's so hard for us to imagine that God's people could be at that place. I mean, the law was central to what it meant to be a Jew. And the same is true for us too. This word right here is so central for what it means for us to be a follower of Christ. It should not be something that we blow the dust off of in the closet of our house. It ought to be central. So as a result of finding the law, he instituted reforms for the people and restored a sense of singular worship of Yahweh. So when you look at a summary, Josiah was definitely a man after God's own heart. It's unclear, especially in light of Zephaniah, whether or not there was true national revival. Okay, when we have these histories that are written, the revival is highlighted, and we see that Josiah was definitely a godly man, but how much of an impact did this actually have on the people? Because Zephaniah is prophesying during this time, and so we've got to figure that out. So regardless, the people have already digressed beyond the mercy of God because they're going to end up in discipline anyway. So when we think about background issues, what we have here, and this is where Josiah becomes king in 640 BC. He's a good king. So we've got the fall of the northern kingdom back here in 722. So we've gone almost 100 years since that happened. Manasseh becomes king, reigns for a long time, pathetic king in the southern kingdom. So really puts this kingdom on a bad trajectory. And this is what the southern kingdom never recovers from, is Manasseh and his evil reign. Ammon becomes king, and he's a bad king as well. Then Josiah all of a sudden comes along, and he's a good king. We see then Assyria, that's who took down the northern kingdom. Assyria falls to Babylon, so Babylon now becomes the major world ruler. And then Josiah dies, and so he's reigning from this particular time right here. And then we're going to have the fall of the southern kingdom. So even though this is going to be a time of revival within the people, we still are on a trajectory to where the southern kingdom is going to go. These revivals, if you want to use some words, would be understood as too little too late. And so they are going to experience the judgment. And this is going to be all part of God's plan. He's going to move this forward. We've got the exile. He's going to bring people back to the land. And then through that, Messiah is going to eventually come. But the message is less, turn to the Lord, and it's more judgment is imminent. I mean, this is going to be coming. Israel just doesn't recover from what happens with the reign of Manasseh, people like that. So look at point B there. If he had a hand in the reforms of King Josiah, and so you got the references there, his message is given more thrust to the reforms, denouncing syncretism. However, if the reforms were superficial, then Zephaniah may have come afterward to recommunicate Yahweh's message. So the issue here, Josiah becomes king here, and it seems like from reading 2 Kings 22 and 23, he immediately implements these reforms. And so is that a result of people like Zephaniah prophesying here, or the reforms come along and Zephaniah is giving it more thrust because we know this impending day is taking place, or during this time period, is there a slackness that begins to develop, and then Zephaniah comes along and really tries to recommunicate those? That's what we don't know. Now, look, next in your notes, it says an argument for Zephaniah coming after the reforms is given by John Hannah's analysis of the contents of the books. So where does he fit? Well, John Hannah analyzes the book, and we see that, again, this is just the second slide. Zephaniah's ministry fits right in there in that particular time period. And we've also got this sense that in 2 Kings 23, the reforms, exile still lies ahead. Okay, we've already talked about all this because of Manasseh. I mean, this is just so bad. Israel never recovers from it. But we do have a reform here. How does Zephaniah fit within that? Well, when we look at Hannah and what he brings out, he analyzes the contents and he pulls out a few points. Number one, in chapter 1, verse 4, the cutting off of the remnant of Baal implies an awakening was in process. In other words, see the word here, remnant of Baal. Something had happened previous that had dealt with Baal, or Baal. The Hebrew word is Baal. Sometimes that's confusing for students. Let me try to say Baal. Baal, and so with the reforms, they dealt with that. But now, because we've got this cutting off of this remnant, it's implying that there's an awakening taking place. So in chapter 1, verse 4, so I will stretch out my hand against Judah and against all the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and I will cut off the remnant of Baal from this place, and the names of the idolatrous priests along with the priests. So, was there a resurgence? That's the issue. Well, Hannah's saying yes, and so his prophecy is coming after the reforms. The second issue that he brings up is Jeremiah, who prophesied long after 622, described Judah's religious moral condition similarly. Now, 622 is important. When did Josiah begin his reign? 640. When did he die? 609. So Jeremiah prophesying in this time period, which would have been after the reforms, he describes Judah's religious moral condition similarly. So Hannah says, based on that, Zephaniah also is prophesying after these reforms. You follow that? So just trying to use Jeremiah as well. And then we have a third here, this reference in chapter 1, verse 8. It says, then it will come about on that day of the Lord's sacrifice that I will punish the princes, the king's sons, and all who clothe themselves with foreign garments. And so this foreign apparel oftentimes is connected with religious practices. But wearing this foreign apparel, so he was old enough to be making decisions. Remember, you've got Josiah's young, and then he's going to eventually get old enough to get married, and then he's going to have children. And so with these decisions that they're making, Hannah's saying he's old enough to make decisions because he's wearing this foreign apparel, making these decisions in his life. And the foreign apparel has this idea of pulling away from his father's direction that he's gone, and connecting the sons connecting themselves with the outside of Israel kind of mentality, worldview, even religious ideology. And then the fourth point that Hannah pulls out is Zephaniah's frequent references to the law suggest he was using the law, which led to the reforms. So remember, a major part of Josiah's reform is finding the law in the temple, blowing the dust off of it and bringing it back out. And so you can see the passages that Hannah's referring to here. There's a number of different passages you could look at and find the law. This right here is not so strong for me, because if a prophet is bringing a word from the Lord, it's going to be connected to the law, right? But the point being made, Zephaniah wouldn't have access to that apart from the law actually being in the people, or in the context of the people, and them actually having the access to it. So that's the point that he's making because of that. And then we've got one more point that he pulls out. Good morning, Riley. Number 5 is the message of impending judgment would be appropriate for those who spurned the religious revival. So in other words, if they just walked away from this revival, then this judgment message is coming to those who walked away from it. God will judge Judah for its disobedience. And that's the theme that we find in passages like chapter 1, verse 7a. Be silent before the Lord God, for the day of the Lord is near. And that's going to be for Judah. And it is near. 586 is where this is going to happen, just 20 years after Josiah dies. So again, the idea that the religious revival, how much did it really take hold? And this is an interesting discussion, and Josiah is actually a good test case for this. When you look at what happens in the king's life, you have this general principle that I've used, teaching Old Testament history and literature, and even in this class, as goes the king, so goes the people. And so what does kings focus on? It focuses on the kings, the political leadership, because as goes the king, so goes the people. And so the general principle is if a king turns to the Lord, then the whole nation follows. But there are some interesting articles scholars who discuss this, and you look deep into the fabric, and this is one of those examples, the book of Zephaniah. Josiah may have been wholeheartedly following the Lord. He may have been instituting these reforms, but how much did that really work its way down into the fabric of society? In other words, how much did the people really, really own it? And that's what we don't know so much, especially when you read Kings, because all you learn about is the king, right? And Josiah was a great king, followed the Lord, and just assumption that everybody's following with this. But when you get into a prophet like Zephaniah, now remember, the prophets give us a 3D. So we've got the story in Kings, and now we get a little bit more dimension, and we realize Josiah, follower of the Lord, an amazing individual, finds the law, reinstitutes all of these observances, is back to the law, guiding the people into it. But now Zephaniah may be giving us a 3D that didn't go as deep into the fabric of society that we might think by reading Kings, but that's what we don't know. So Hannah's saying that what happens in Zephaniah, there is this revival, but it doesn't stick that well. And so, whether that's because it didn't go deep enough, or whether the people, enough time goes by and now they're back to flirting with their gods and following after them, whatever, Zephaniah comes along and he's got to really go after this and make this a stronger point. So he comes at some of the same issues that were there even before that revival, to whatever degree it took place. You follow that? That's what Hannah's trying to deal with. So is it giving it a stronger thrust because it doesn't go deep, or did it go deep and then the people depart from it, and now Zephaniah comes along and says, come on, we've got to get back. Judgment is looming. And so the message of the book really does revolve around that judgment. Now, as far as structure goes, did you have a difficult time outlining the book? What do you think? Matt, difficult?
Not that I remember.
No, you felt like it flowed fairly well. What were your main divisions that you have?
1:1 to 3:7, and then 3:8 to 20.
Okay, so you went 1:1 to 3:7, big chunk, and you entitled that what?
God's judgment upon the nations of the world.
And then 3:8 to 20 is where you
God
have.
is faithful and restores covenant people.
Okay, God is faithful. So you just lumped all that together, and you've got the judgment, and then you've got the restoration that takes place. Michaeline, how'd you do it?
I did pretty much the same.
Okay, really? So 1:1 to 3:7?
I put 3:8.
Okay, 3. All right, let's debate that. Is it 3:7 or is it 3:8?
Yeah, Lord's judgment and then Lord's blessing.
Okay, Jeff, how'd you do it?
I did 1:1 to 2:15. The day of the Lord is prepared for the world, and repentance is invited.
Okay, so 1:1 to 2:15, and we got this world theme, all right?
And then 3:1 through 20. The Lord will judge the world and Judah specifically, bringing forth a righteous and purified remnant.
So in chapter 3 is where you bring Judah in there specifically, but you get this remnant that flows out. Would you say the purified?
Righteous and purified remnant.
Righteous and purified remnant. And so just a little bit of a shift there. Christina?
I did similar to Jess. It was basically chapters 1 and 2 were punishment for oppression and sinful behavior, and then chapter 3 was extending grace, and then the remnant.
Okay, so still, all of us, where the similarity is, we understand that in chapters 1 and 2, you've got this judgment to the nations, and then that bleeds over into Judah in chapter 3, and then there's this restoration of the remnant. So depending on where we divide that up, each one of them would be sufficient. Eric, any differences?
I just separated a little bit more. I had like 4 divisions.
Okay, how'd you do it?
I just had 1 through 6, which is announcement of judgment on Judah. I had 1, 7 through 18, which is the day of the Lord. I had 2, 1 to 3, 7, which was the judgment on the nations as well as Judah. And 3, 8 to 20, which is the restoration.
Okay, so in yours, you actually want to separate out the earlier reference to Judah and the day of the Lord, and then it broadens out to these nations, and then it comes back again. Okay, well, there's a number of different ways that we can actually think through that. There are basically, when you look at what's going on in scholarship, I think that you can make a fairly strong case that there are 3 major sections, at least when you just try to look at what they do generally out there. You've got judgment to all the earth and Judah found in that first chapter where you go chapter 1, chapter 1 verse 1 obviously is this little introduction to the book. And then the rest of chapter 1 is judgment to all the earth. And then you've got Judah there as well. And then when you get to chapter 2 verses 1 through 3, you have this hinge. And so we're going to see two hinges in this book that scholars often reference. But then it moves us, that hinge carries us to 2:4 through 3:7, judgment on surrounding nations and Jerusalem. Again, so you've got judgment to all the earth in Judah, judgment on surrounding nations and Jerusalem, and you really have a complete sense because you've got nations to the north, you've got nations to the east, to the west, and to the south. And so it just tries to pull that out. When you look at a map, you realize what's being referenced here is not necessarily specific nations, although that might be important, but what's being referenced here is the completeness. Okay, every part of the compass is being referenced here. God is going to be complete in what he does. And then we've got another hinge in chapter 3, verses 8 and 9, and then that moves us into the restoration part. So these hinges help really pull these messages together. In chapter 2, verse 1, gather yourselves together. Yes, gather, O nation without shame, before the decree takes effect. The day passes like the chaff. Before the burning anger of the Lord comes upon you, before the day of the Lord anger come upon you, seek the Lord, all you humble of the earth who have carried out his ordinances. Seek righteousness, seek humility. Perhaps you will be hidden in the day of the Lord's anger. See, that's that hinge. You've got all of this judgment, but this little call right here, and I think that's such interesting terminology where it says in verse 8, perhaps you will be hidden. And so you get all these cataclysmic kind of things where, this judgment just falls. But if you seek the Lord, perhaps he'll hide you. You think of the Lord being a refuge or in the cleft of the rock in the midst of all these cataclysmic things taking place. Perhaps you'll be hidden from that. In other words, you'll escape it. So there's a call. And then in chapter 3, in verses 8 and 9 as well, therefore wait for me. I love that word wait. Remember, that's the next study that I'm going to do in the Old Testament. Therefore wait for me, declares the Lord, for the day when I rise up to the prey. Indeed, my decision is to gather nations, to assemble kingdoms, to pour out on them indignation, all my burning anger. For all the earth will be devoured by the fire of my zeal. For then I will give to the peoples purified lips, that all of them may call in the name of the Lord to serve him shoulder to shoulder. So here, it's a call to seek the Lord, and here, it's a determination of what the Lord's going to do. The Lord will accomplish this. And I love these kind of passages in the Old Testament because it is such a huge reminder that God is going to make this happen. God is going to bring this about. God is the one who gives purified lips. He's the one who makes it so they call on him. And so it's just a powerful work of the Lord. And then that leads into the restoration, especially for the remnant of what God is going to do. So this wait for me is just so powerful. Wait for the day, wait for all the earth, because the Lord is going to do something powerful. All right? Now let's look at the message of Zephaniah there. When we think about the overall message, once again, we find both the messages of judgment and restoration. Okay? Again, day of the Lord usually involves both of those. Now, we think of the day of the Lord oftentimes in terms of judgment, but usually it's judgment to those who oppose the Lord, but then it's also restoration to those who belong to the Lord. So we've got this universal day of the Lord, you see in chapter 1, verses 2 and 3. And then you've got Judah's day of the Lord from 1:4 to 2:3. So it starts off big. I will completely remove all things from the face of the earth. That is huge. Now remember back to Dr. Sandy's article about when you get into this kind of language, the cataclysmic language, remember he says the ultimate point there is to initiate a response in the heart of people who hear this. But I mean, this is big. Completely remove all things from the face of the earth, man, beast, birds. I mean, this is an undoing of creation. But then in verse 4, he zeroes that in. So I will stretch out my hand against Judah. And you've got Jerusalem. And so the focus is going to be brought in to the Lord's people. So you've got the universal day, and then you've got Judah's day. And there the prophet mentions idolatry in verses 4 and 5, and even abandonment of Yahweh. And the context for this is 2 Kings 18 with King Hezekiah. And then 21, you've got Manasseh and Josiah. And so that's the context for all that's taking place in this time period. And there are 4 groups of people who are named here in this passage. 4 groups. And these are the 4 groups. Now look in verse 5 and 6 of chapter 1. And this is really interesting for us to think through this. And those who bow down on the housetops to the host of heaven, that's the worship of other gods. And those who bow down and swear to the Lord, yet swear by Milcom as well. And so here's where you have the syncretism, the worship of other gods and Yahweh. And then in verse 6, and those who have turned back from following the Lord, in other words, they've just walked away from anything to do with the Lord. And then finally, and those who have not sought the Lord or inquired of him. And so there's actually one of the groups of people would be considered those who really have not even been introduced to the Lord. Now, how does that happen when you've got this huge revival and the finding of the law? And so this is obviously looking at a big time period. But think about that. I mean, those who just outright worship other gods, those who are trying to do the I want God and the world thing, and then those who are just saying, I've given up on the Lord, and those who have never really been given the opportunity. When you think about our world today, even our culture, you have people who fit into these categories right here, where they try, maybe even in our churches, we have people who fit into each one of these categories. Even though they've turned, maybe they still attend and trying to find something religious of what's going on there. But this becomes just a dangerous place for Israel to be. This is not pointing to the passing on of the law, where people recognize their call to love the Lord their God with all their heart, soul, might, and strength, and their neighbor as their self. This does not look like a covenant people that's passing this covenant down from generation to generation. And so we've got some problems in Judah, and that's why judgment is coming to them. Now it also talks about some objects of the day. And when it talks about this day of the Lord coming, we've got idolaters that are a part of this day. The mention of princes again. Okay, they're wearing these foreign apparels. Somehow they're being sucked into this other way of life. We've got oppressors who are a part of this. Merchants, remember some of what we talked about with merchants in some of the previous books, and that classes and the separation, the oppression of the poor. And then even what we might call indifferent. And it will come about at that time that I will search Jerusalem with lamps, and I will punish the men who are stagnant in spirit, who say in their hearts, the Lord will not do good or evil. I mean, they're just walking away. They just see God as just someone who doesn't really connect with this world. Moreover, their wealth will become plunder, their houses desolate. Yes, they will build houses but not inhabit them, plant vineyards but not drink their wine. So the Lord is coming at all different aspects of Judah. There's no one who's going to escape this. You've got all the worship system, you've got leadership, you've got those who are oppressing, merchants. A lot of that fits into the same category, and those who just say, hey, God's not really engaged with what's going on in our world. But there's also a description of the day that we have, and this is where I think some of you pick up that this is a rather terrifying book. Because when you get to the description of the day, when you're looking at chapter 1, 14 through 18, I mean, it just pounds this day, doesn't it? It just gives it all kind of description. The nearness of the day and the horror of the day. This is not going to be a light day. Near is the great day of the Lord. Near, coming very quickly. Listen. Say the idea, you can hear the day. Listen, the day of the Lord. And so all that nearness, but then day of wrath, trouble, distress, destruction, desolation, darkness, gloom, clouds, thick darkness, trumpet, battle cry against the fortified city, against the high towers. I will bring distress. They will walk like blind. Again, because they've sinned against the Lord, their blood will be poured out like dust, and their flesh like dung. Neither the silver nor the gold will be able to deliver them. I mean, this is going to be a horrible day that's coming up. And again, we've got the focus here being, we've got this universal as well as Judah being a part of this. But there are some deterrents to the day, and that's where chapter 2 and that hinge becomes important. What is a deterrent to the day? The Lord, when he sets out warnings like this, it's not because he's trying to say, hey, guess what? It's going to get really bad. Ha, 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 ha. The Lord is trying to turn people's hearts. And so the deterrents are repentance and seeking the Lord. And that's where we see that perhaps you will be hidden in the day of the Lord's anger. If a heart turns back to the Lord, then that is what enables someone to be back in the fellowship with the Lord and to be back in relationship with Him. And so there's a massive horror to the day, but there are deterrents to the day. And that's when you see also point C, there's a warning of the devastation of judgment, and followed by a call to repent. And that's just important to see the overall point of what's going on here. As you think about this warning of devastation followed by a call to repent, there's an emphasis on nearness. There's an emphasis on the severity of their sin. And there's an emphasis on covenant implications. And again, what we're pulling in here is Mount Sinai and Deuteronomy 28, Leviticus 26 type language. And so the message, for those of you who felt like the message of this book was kind of intense, it's because of these kinds of things that you read and you felt. But notice a lot of it happens very early in the book. Some of it continues on later on, but it's just right up front where we see a lot of this emphasis. And then in following this, we have the nation's day of the Lord as well. And again, what I was saying earlier was, what we're emphasizing is when you have Judah, we're really moving up. You know, you got Assyria, and you've got Cush, which is down this way. You've got Assyria over this way, and then up to the north is where would be more of a Babylon type of approach. And so the nations, it's just trying to show all points of the globe, is what it's trying to show us, that this is going to be complete. Starting with Judah, God is going to, when you go back to the chapter 1, verses 2 and 3, God is going to completely remove. I mean, this is going to be totality, ultimately, that they're going to be up against. And so you've got Philistia over here, you got Cush down there, you've got Moab and Ammon up in this direction, and then we've already talked about Cush, and then Assyria over this way. It's just going to be complete in what we have. And so the reason there is all of the above are traditional enemies of the nation. So this is partially a message of hope for Judah. So even though their own impending doom is hanging right out there in front of them, 586, we're about 20, 30 years away from this. This is also hope for them. God is going to watch over them, and He's going to take care of them. So when He takes care of these nations, but also Jerusalem in chapter 3, 1 to 5, and this is where we get a focus on leadership again. As goes the leaders, so goes the people. The conclusion of all the judgment oracles is found in verses 6 through 8. And again, we end up where we started in chapter 1, 2, and 3. I will cut off nations. Their corner towers in ruins. I've made their streets desolate. And just talks about the complete severity of it. I said, surely you will revere me, accept instruction. So our dwelling will not be cut off according to all that I have appointed concerning her, but they were eager to corrupt all their deeds. But then there's going to be a shift, and there's going to be a restoration. So the reason is to cause Judah to accept her correction, but she does not. And so God's trying to get Judah's attention. Judah doesn't correct that, and so that's why eventually we end up in a place where the fall of Jerusalem, the fall of Judah, Babylon comes in, and the Lord brings a corrective. But the restoration is still going to be a part of what God's going to do, and this is why the book ends on a positive note. All nations will worship Yahweh. That's incredible. And so again, when you get to the New Testament and we are ambassadors, and what do? We take the message of Jesus Christ to the nations. And even in passages in Matthew it says, and when the gospel is preached to all the nations, or even people groups, probably the better way to understand that, then the end will come. And so that's what we're waiting for. We're waiting for that message to go to the nations. And one day God is going to do this kind of work. And all enemies are destroyed, and Israel is restored, and Yahweh again is king. And so when you get to verse 15, the Lord has taken away his judgments against you. He has cleared away your enemies. The King of Israel, the Lord is in your midst. You will fear disaster no more. And that's what the Lord always wanted for Judah, right? Is for the king to be in their midst. Because as long as the king was in their midst, they enjoyed the blessings of the covenant in Deuteronomy 28. But because of sin, because of Israel's rebellion, turning away, eventually the Lord is the one who steps in and purifies lips. Now, how is the Lord going to do things like purify lips? This is where you start seeing some connections to the new covenant. Okay, the Lord's going to give a new heart. He's going to bring his spirit on people. He's going to bring about a transformation. It's not using new covenant language here, but how is this going to take place? Well, it's going to be new covenant that's really going to bring this about eventually. So when it says in verse 9 of chapter 3, then I will give to the peoples purified lips, that all of them may call on the name of the Lord. How's that going to happen? That's new covenant terminology. God's going to do something radical in the lives of people. All right, there's a lot we could say about theological themes in Zephaniah, but what did you find for application for this book? Take us to some chapter and verse references, and how did God use this in your own life to encourage you, and to just how did he work its way into your heart? What did you come up with? Who wants to start us off? Caroline, lead the way. What did you come up with application?
I put that the Lord seeks after the redemption of his people. Even like multiple times, no matter how many times we fall, he's constantly seeking after our redemption after that. So it's kind of just like a reminder to continue to repent, even if it's a sin that you keep on repenting over.
Yeah, so you've got chapter 2, 1-3, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, there's always the opportunity to seek the Lord.
Mm-hmm. And then he still desires restoration of his people back to him is 2:7 and 3:20.
Yeah, and so that desire that the Lord has, so that he can, in chapter 2, verse 7, for the Lord their God will care for them and restore their fortune. That's what the Lord longs to do. When you read the Bible, the Lord longs to bless his people. But you've got to put yourself in that circle of blessing. And so the way you do that is by seeking him, by following after him, by honoring him in the way that he deserves. That's the way blessing gets poured out. And again, the book of Zephaniah makes it clear that all God's efforts to steer Judah back, I mean, we've already seen Israel go down, Judah's not turning back. So what happens? The Lord steps in and he purifies the lips. He's going to step in and he's going to do what rebellious hearts have not done. He's going to purify lips that all may call on the name of the Lord. And that is something we have so much to be thankful for that. I mean, why am I a believer and my neighbor is not? Is it because I've got a smarter brain and I realize, wow, the gospel's good news. I'm going to accept that and be a believer? Or Is it because the Lord has done something in me, enabling me to call on the name of the Lord? And that's where we begin seeing, wow, the mercy of God is deep and rich and amazing that he would do that for us. And so I love passages like this, very new covenant. Then I will give to the people purified lips that all of them may call on the name of the Lord. How do we get to the place of calling on the name of the Lord? He gives us purified lips. Thank you, Lord. Thank you. That's the gospel. He justifies us, ultimately. So the fulfillment of this is ultimately going to be God pours out his wrath on Christ and then justifies us. Purified lips. All right, who else? Application. Elise, how'd you apply this book?
I talked about pride, there's not a lot in Zephaniah, and just how the Lord, like, broke them down, but all for his glory, and like brought them closer to him. And how, in the same way, when like I've worked through hard things and don't see how it's gonna end up good, how it is for his glory.
Yeah, oftentimes when we find ourselves in the midst of life, we make ourselves the center, don't we? That's ultimately what pride is. We make ourselves the center. We are God. Everything revolves around us. Everything should be fixed according to our desires, our wishes. Everything should be for our good. And we can just push God out of all that. Well, God is constantly trying to work his way back in, isn't he? Constantly. And when you read the Bible, if you had me for Old Testament history and literature, you know I believe this strongly, that God rigs the world with difficulty to drive us back to him in dependence. Not independence, in dependence on him. He knows that's where life is going to be found for us. And so when we create ourselves into an independent being, who say in our heart, there is no God, or who say in our heart, hey, I can handle things on my own, God in his mercy will break that down because there's no life there. That's the path to death. It seems like it's going to bring about something good because we're in control. Finally, my life. That's death. And so God will do in his mercy, he'll break that down to bring us to a place of dependence. And again, when are we most likely to cry out to the Lord? It's in our time of need, right? It's when our life has been broken down somewhat. It's when something's been taken from us and we feel vulnerable. We cry out to him in dependence, and really we walk away from our own independence because we know we need him. And so this is what the Lord does, and that's merciful that he does that. It hurts. It doesn't feel good, but James 1:2 says, count it all joy because this is good for you. And that's why even Romans 8 can say God causes all things to work together for good. That's in the context of all creation groaning and we ourselves groaning. Why? Because we're longing for this day. We're going to be freed from all this stuff, a world that's cursed, our own sinfulness and frailty, and where God will rightfully reign. As we see in chapter 3, verse 15, the King of Israel, the Lord is in your midst. You will fear disaster no more. And when you give God that rightful place in your life, you will fear disaster no more. Now, disaster may happen, right? But you don't have to fear it because you're in the hands of a loving God who's sovereign and who's watching over everything. And so even Judah can go through the destruction of Babylon. They can go into exile, and they still have nothing to fear if they have their hearts in the right place with the Lord. He's going to watch over them. He's going to work out a plan for them and continue to carry them forward. All right, one more. Application. Yes, Esther.
I talked about how the Lord delights in his people, especially with verse 3:17. Sometimes I think we seem to think that God's like grumpy towards us, or he doesn't really care, he's just kind of indifferent, which, I mean, the people in Judah were thinking that he didn't really care one way or the other. But his treatment of the remnant in Zephaniah really demonstrates that he takes joy in his people and he wants to be that fixed towards his people.
Yeah, it's a beautiful verse, isn't it? I mean, he rejoices over you. Now, think about it. See how the verse begins. The Lord your God is in your midst, a victorious warrior. In other words, sin, Satan has sought to take his people down, and now he's purified their lips and given them a heart that can call on his name, and now the king is in their midst, and then the Lord rejoices over all of that. But ultimately, what is the Lord rejoicing over? It's what he's done in us, right? Because who brought about the purified lips? He did. But the idea of the Lord rejoicing over you, I hope that that's a picture that you can carry through the day, that he rejoices over you. When you are redeemed, he rejoices over you. You were lost, and now you're found. You were dead, now you're alive, and he rejoices over you. He exults over you in a way that I don't think we always fully appreciate or understand. He doesn't loathe us. Now, maybe you've been battling sin and you just think the Lord just loathes you. No, he's going to discipline you. He wants you to know abundant life, but he's rejoicing over you because you were dead and you've been made alive. You were far off. He brought you near. He adopted you. And there's coming a future day when he's going to do this kind of work in you, purified lips, with a name that calls on him, a recognition of him as king. He's going to do all that. So we have a lot to be thankful for. As you go into Thanksgiving, be thankful for the gospel. I mean, just be thankful for the gospel. Take some time to ponder the gospel. Sit down and do some light reading in the book of Romans. And just remember the gospel and just rejoice over it. All right?
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.